Okay, 24 hours later, if you're ready for some calm analysis about what we all saw last night, this is the place to be for the next hour. The very first thing you need to know about what we all saw last night is that most voters didn't see it. It was the lowest rated presidential debate in a very long time. It had the smallest audience of any first presidential debate, first in a series, in the 21st century. And only about 1/3 of the people who voted in the last presidential election actually watched the debate. Only 51 million viewers out of 155 million voters who voted last time. So 2/3 of the voters didn't see a second of what happened last night. And that's an important number to have in mind when you consider the impact of presidential debates, because everyone who thinks that that thing last night was some kind of big problem for Joe Biden believes, without evidence, that the debate changed the minds of undecided voters, even though undecided voters are the most likely kind of people to not watch debates like last night. In 1980, when we had about half of the voting population we have now, half the voting population we have now, the presidential debate got 80 million viewers. Almost every voter watched that debate. In 1980, 85 million votes were cast in the presidential election, and 80 million people watched that debate. That's a big difference. Faithful audiences of this program will know that I have, in every presidential campaign season, insisted repeatedly that these so-called debates that were invented by and for television do not test anything that is actually part of the daily job of the presidency. No one ever runs into the Oval Office and says, Mr. President, you have 2 minutes to explain your position on some subject. Presidents discuss one subject at a time in the Oval Office. They do it in detail for as long as they want or as short as they want. They read briefing papers, if their name is not Trump, about that subject before each of those discussions. Most presidencies never have an emergency, a run-in-the-room emergency. There is never a moment when someone rushes in giving the president an immediate emergency problem that the president has to solve. That did happen to one of those candidates on the stage last night. And when he faced that emergency, his choice was to do absolutely nothing for 187 minutes. He froze for 187 minutes on January 6th, while his supporters were attacking the Capitol and trying to overturn the presidential election through violence. Last night, in Donald Trump's first debate appearance since January 6th, the debate moderators did not ask him what the January 6th committee very much wanted to ask him: what were you doing for those 187 minutes? Instead of that hugely important question, the very first question written by a committee, as these questions always are in these kinds of debates, very first question to Donald Trump was, you want to impose a 10% tariff on all goods coming into the U.S. How will you ensure that that doesn't drive prices even higher? Trump, it's not going to drive them higher. That's it. That was the answer. A tariff, by definition, is an increase in a price. That is the very point of tariffs, to increase the consumer price of imported goods, everything from clothes to cars. In Trump's case, a 10% increase on the price of every single thing imported into the United States. So a new $4,000 tax you would pay on a $40,000 car. That $40,000 car becomes a $44,000 car because of Donald Trump's tariffs. This debate, that wasn't a real debate, pretended the tariffs are not tariffs. They let that happen. The better question to Donald Trump would have been, what is a tariff? Because he proved last night that he doesn't know And he proved that his true believers do not know what a tariff is. Donald Trump said that his tariffs are going to force China, quote, to pay us a lot of money. That was the very first of Donald Trump's long list of lies, over 50 of them, in that so-called debate. American tariffs can only be paid by American consumers of those goods. A 10% tariff on Chinese goods will not cost anyone in China 1 penny. It will not cost the government of China a penny. No business in China will be cost a penny by a Trump tariff. This is the kind of lie that no presidential debater would ever have attempted to tell prior to Donald Trump, and it was the least of his lies.
I didn't have sex with a porn star.
And you now live in a country where most of the public commentators with access to microphones declared the liar the winner of the debate, and the loser, in their view, was the older man with the weaker voice, who struggled to tell the truth in a ridiculous format that he is no longer any good at, and that has nothing to do with the job of president, a format that does not test the job of president. Most of the coverage of the event actively encourages the voters to look at that as superficially as possible and focus only on what the commentators call the performance and never the policy. The word panic started showing up on banners on your television screens. And then, of course, came the unrealistic notions that there is a magical candidate who can emerge to pick up the banner as the Democratic presidential nominee. Not one person who makes that suggestion has said who that magical candidate is and how and through what process the nomination could be delivered to that magical candidate. The New York Times editorial encouraging Joe Biden to leave the race, published tonight, at least admits, perhaps inadvertently at the end, that the New York Times doesn't have any idea how this should happen, because the editorial says the Democrats must, quote, create a process to select someone more capable to stand in his place to defeat Mr. Trump in November. Create a process, because the process does not exist. And there is no polling data to even begin to suggest that that candidate exists. There's no polling data. The only other Democrat to this day who has ever polled well against Donald Trump, the only Democrat who's polled strongly against Donald Trump, is Joe Biden. The second best polling candidate among Democrats against Donald Trump is actually Vice President Kamala Harris. The magical dream candidates are completely unknown to most people in the country, governors of states like California, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and not one of those governors polls anywhere close to Kamala Harris or Joe Biden against Donald Trump. And not one of those governors has ever raised $1 of campaign funding that can be used in a federal presidential campaign. They don't have 1 penny to run with. And that is not a minor technical point. Campaign money is not some minor technicality. I heard this talk once before on the Democratic side in 1992 at exactly this point on the calendar in June, when Bill Clinton was running third at a tiny 25% of the vote against Ross Perot's leading 39% and President George H.W. Bush's 31%. And there was panic in the halls of Congress about that, where I was working at the time. There was much talk of trying to replace Bill Clinton as the nominee, even though he had the nomination locked up through the primaries. There was talk of somehow getting Mario Cuomo, the governor of New York, who already refused to run for president that year, to take the nomination somehow away from Bill Clinton. Or George Mitchell, then majority leader of the United States Senate. And I knew George Mitchell and worked with George Mitchell in those days. And I knew that that talk about George Mitchell was preposterous. George Mitchell knew it was preposterous. And it was being pushed by other members of Congress, including senators, who knew absolutely nothing about the complexity of running a presidential campaign. They were all dreaming about something none of them knew how to do. And in the end, all that panic was for nothing. Bill Clinton won. He won with 43% of the vote. The next time we saw this kind of panic was on the Republican side in 2016, when the Access Hollywood video came out and prominent Republicans started pulling their endorsements from Donald Trump that very day and talking about finding a way to replace him as their nominee. Republican Congressman Jason Chaffetz made his one and only appearance on this program that night when the Access Hollywood tape broke, and he said this.
I can't, my wife and I, we have a 15-year-old daughter. How in the world could I look my 15-year-old daughter in the eye and say, honey, you know what? Your dad endorses Donald Trump for president. I can't do that. I can't do, and I won't do that. And that's why I'm withdrawing my endorsement.
He wasn't the only one. A bunch of endorsements were withdrawn that day. No endorsements, none, have been withdrawn from Joe Biden. None. Jason Chaffetz's daughter is now 23 years old, and she has watched her father fully endorse Donald Trump for president 3 times now, 3 times in a row, because only 19 days after Jason Chaffetz said that here on this program, he reversed himself and announced that he was voting for Donald Trump for president, and he did not explain to anyone how he explained that to his daughter. And we know who won that election. In fact, no party has ever abandoned a nominee. The last time we saw something close to it, a presumptive nominee drop out of the race, was in March of 1968 when President Lyndon Johnson announced he would not run for re-election. His vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who did not run in a single primary, won the nomination at the convention in Chicago because back in those days, most of the delegates went to the convention free to vote for anyone. That has never happened again because of a rules change beginning in 1972 that created the current system of voters choosing the nominee through primaries. And it's worth noting in 1968, which you can read all about in my book about that presidential campaign called Playing with Fire, Hubert Humphrey lost that election to Republican Richard Nixon by less than 1% of the vote, and the Humphrey campaign quite reasonably blamed their loss on not being able to raise enough money in so short a time and not having enough time to build a presidential campaign around a candidate who was forced to enter the race so late and not run in a single primary. We won't get our first major clues about the effect of last night's debate, which was not seen by most voters until polls begin to emerge sometime next week. Focus groups last night indicated no real shifts among voters. There's an overnight poll indicating no shifts among voters. One of the striking things about focus group responses is that they knew Donald Trump was lying most of the time, even without Donald Trump being formally fact-checked at the event. With the debate behind them, both candidates got back on the campaign trail today.
We win here, we win the election. And here's how we're going to do it. We're going to stand up for the women of America. We're going to restore Roe v. Wade as the law of the land. We're going to stand up for the right to vote. We're going to stand up for Medicare and Social Security. We're going to fight for child care, paid leave, and elder care. We're going to keep lowering the cost of prescription drugs, not just for seniors, but for every single American. We're going to keep protecting the Affordable Care Act, which is why more than 40 million Americans have health insurance today. They didn't before. We're going to protect our children and get the weapons of war off our streets. We're going to provide clean drinking water, affordable high-speed internet, quality education for every child in America. We're going to secure our border and protect legal immigration. And unlike the other guy, we're going to stand up to dictators like Putin, because America bows to no one. No one ever. Folks, and we're going to keep dealing with the climate crisis.
Global warming is fine.
How about the fact that 40 out of his 44 top advisors, including the vice president, aren't supporting him this time around? The people who know him best, 40 of them said, I will not support the man I work for this time around. It tells you a lot about the person who knows him. Look, he lied about how great he was on crime. I had to remind him that he oversaw a record increase in murder rates in 2020. On my watch, violent crime has hit a 50-year low. There's more to do with this 50-year low. And then I pointed out that the only convicted criminal on the stage last night was Donald Trump. When I thought about his 34 felony convictions, his sexual assault on a woman in a public place, his being fined $400 million for business fraud, I thought to myself, Donald Trump isn't just a convicted felon. Donald Trump is a one-man crime wave.
Biden's Department of Justice has wrongly prosecuted hundreds of Americans for peacefully protesting on January 6th.
And then, his biggest lie, he lied about how he had nothing to do with the insurrection of January 6th. We all saw with our own eyes. We watched it on television. We saw thousands in his direction attack the Capitol. We saw police being attacked, the Capitol being ransacked, the mob hunting for Speaker Pelosi, gallows literally set up for Mike Pence. And then he told them as he sat in the dining room, the private dining room, one door off my Oval Office. He sat there for 3 hours watching the TV. He did not a single thing to stop it. Nothing. Nothing at all. I know we have more to do to get prices down. We have to take on corporate greed. They're making twice the profit they were before the pandemic. We got to make housing more affordable, provide child care, make the tax code fair. 16 Nobel winners of the Nobel Prize have looked at my economic plan this week. They've issued a report. And a Trump's plan. Here's what they concluded. They said that my plan would continue to grow the economy and bring down inflation. 16 Nobel laureates. And that Trump's plan would send the nation into recession and inflation soaring through the roof.
All they know is electric. They want electric army tanks. They want electric planes. What happens if the sun isn't shining while you're up in the air? Well, sir, I told you there'd be problems, sir. No, they want electric everything.
Folks, I don't walk as easy as I used to. I don't speak as smoothly as I used to. I don't debate as well as I used to. But I know what I do know. I know how to tell the truth. I know right from wrong. And I know how to do this job. I know how to get things done. And I know, like millions of Americans know, when you get knocked down, you get back up.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.